Thank you for joining Mrs. Parkman's Academy of Needlework for a presentation on band samplers. Needlework begins with a needle, and if the stitches made with that needle form a pattern, that is embroidery. Embroidery is enrichment by means of a needle, and embroidery has enriched my life in so many ways. We would not be here today enjoying each other's company if it was not for our love of a needle. The decoration of textiles with embroidery provides a wealth of information on social history, design and costume. Embroidery flourished in England during the 13th, 14th and 15th century with the birth of a new style called opus Anglicanum that was often used in ecclesiastical hangings and garments. The style comprised of two types of stitches, split stitch and underside couching, and used metal and cotton threads to create incredibly detailed embroidery. It was such a time-consuming technique that the embroidery in this era became extremely valuable and sought after. After the Protestant Reformation and the closure of the monasteries and convents, there was little demand for ecclesiastic work, and it became more common to see embroidery used for clothing or household decoration. A 1547 account of the wardrobe of Henry VIII shows that just over half of the 224 items were ornamented with embroidery of some kind. Embroidered shirts and accessories were popular New Year gifts to the Tudor monarchs. Fine linen shirts, chemises, ruffs and caps were embroidered in monochrome silks and edged in lace. The monochrome works are classified as blackwork embroidery even when worked in other colours. Gold, red, blue, green and pink were popular colours. It is often assumed that blackwork, sometimes called Spanish work, was introduced into England by Katharine of Aragon when she arrived in 1501. In fact, it was already known in the 1400s. The stable society that existed between the accession of Elizabeth I in 1558 and the English Civil War encouraged the building and furnishing of new houses in which rich textiles played a part. This led to a great flowering of English domestic embroidery in the Elizabethan and Jacobean eras. In the 1600s, trade routes expanded and an increase in trading by the East India Company saw silks become more readily available in England. This was the golden age of band samplers, and as I've explored samplers and delved into their history, it is the band sampler that has fired my passion. They call to me the loudest. Young girls practice a diverse and broad range of stitches on spot motif and band samplers. They decorated caskets, mirrors and pictures, sometimes spending years working on such projects. Elizabeth Dean, whose sampler was in the Jacobi collection, took 9 years to complete her task. Samplers were the traditional test pieces worked by young girls. The designs were varied, yet have many similarities. Colour schemes were bold, and some were even enhanced with the use of metallic threads and semi-precious stones. They would have been visually striking. Today, the metallic threads are tarnished and the silks often faded from exposure to light, but they are still objects of great beauty. Band samplers comprise of neatly worked rows of patterns suitable for repeating motifs on long, narrow strips of linen. They can include a variety of counted stitches, usually worked over 2 or 3 threads of linen, needle lace, stump work and whitework. They celebrate the Elizabethan love of patterns. They feature the stepped, angular patterns characteristic of early blackwork, ultimately deriving from medieval Islamic Egypt and were introduced to Europe through trade. Later, these patterns were influenced by German and Italian decorative art. It is interesting to note that the border patterns on early samplers were only ever worked as straight sections and never demonstrated how the embroiderer ought to take a corner. Such patterns were designed to be used as edgings and not as frames. The earliest dated surviving sampler is housed in the Victoria and Albert Museum and was made by Jane Bostock, who included her name and the date 1598 in the inscription. The earliest documented reference to sampler making goes back another 96 years, to the 1502 household expense accounts of Elizabeth of York, the wife of Henry VII. Her expense accounts record the purchase of linen to make a sampler for the Queen. The stitches used in band samplers were often reversible. When stitches were worked on items such as clothing, both sides of the fabric could be visible when worn. Whilst embroidery styles have gone in and out of fashion over the centuries, many of the basic stitches have remained the same. The names of some of the stitches have been lost through the passing of time. It is believed that Spanish stitch and true stitch are the names used for double running stitch in the 15 and 1600s. This stitch was found in the vast majority of samplers from the 1600s. Marking stitch is a reversible variation of modern-day cross-stitch, and queen stitch is the original term for the Rococo stitch or Renaissance stitch. Samplers were also called samcloths. They were a storehouse for motifs and embroidery techniques. Band samplers illustrate the tradition of handing down designs from generation to generation. Making a sampler was not just a way of practicing and experimenting, it produced a visual catalogue of stitches. Samplers were valuable and practical items that could be kept, compared, reused and passed on. It is not surprising to find that they are mentioned in various documents such as inventories and wills. There were samplers recorded in a 1634 inventory of the Countess of Leicester, who was the grandniece of Anne Boleyn and the wife of Elizabeth I's favourite, Robert Dudley. These samplers were probably worked by her and her ladies. This sampler is dated 1648 and inscribed Mary Potts wrought this sampler and this date. This is the most common type of sampler from the 1600s, and its standard format was established by about 1630. Polychrome band samplers are typical, although some band samplers combined rows of whitework, cutwork and needle lace. The variety of stitching techniques in the rows of Mary's sampler records her embroidery skills. Such skills were considered particularly important, not only to the management of Mary's future household and family, but they would also have served as evidence of her education and her parents' ability to provide her with one. The alphabet at the bottom of the sampler and her inscription demonstrates her ability to mark household linen. It was common practice to include initials and numbers on household linens so that women could track their household goods when they were laundered. This band sampler by Margret Barber was probably worked between 1661 and 1663, as both dates are recorded. It is divided into rows within 3 larger sections. each of which showcases a specific technique. Samplers containing whitework, cutwork and needle lace were attempted after basic skills were mastered. The bottom of Margret's sampler is worked in reticella, a technique that originated in the late 15th century. The technique developed from cutwork and utilised stitches common to embroidery. Threads were pulled from a plain weave linen fabric to create open spaces in which design was completed. The deconstructed fabric was stabilised primarily with buttonhole stitches. The result is a design based on the grid of the foundation fabric with open areas throughout and arched and scalloped borders. Subsequently, the technique progressed to the point where the foundation fabric was eliminated and the design was worked over threads temporarily secured to a piece of vellum or paper for stability during the construction of what was called punto in aria, literally stitches in air. Designs for reticella were popularised through numerous editions of continental pattern books published in the late 1500s. Copies of these books made their way into England. In 1603, James I repealed the Elizabethan sumptuary laws, which was a dress code for the social classes. These laws attempted to make clear the necessary and appropriate distinctions between levels of society. The laws dictated what colour and type of clothing, furs, fabrics and trims were allowed to persons of various ranks or incomes. In the case of clothing, this was intended, amongst other reasons, to reduce spending on foreign textiles and to ensure that people did not dress above their station. As a result of the sumptuary laws being repealed, there were many excesses in fashion, especially in men's costumes. Large sums of money were spent on clothing, and in particular on lace. The finest lace was imported at great cost and was only affordable to the very rich. Therefore, the cultivation of practical skill in whitework and lace techniques would enable the maker to produce all manner of trimming necessary to fashionable attire. It is uncertain how much actual needle lace trimming was produced in England during the 1600s, but there are a relatively large number of surviving whitework samplers. This sampler is made up of bands that feature birds, acorns, pineapples and a variety of flowers. The bottom of the sampler includes an alphabet consisting of a mix of upper and lower case letters, and small, seemingly random place motifs resembling a spot sampler. Spot samplers are composed of collections of patterns and stitches to which the maker might refer to when she was in need of inspiration or guidance for a particular technique. They do not usually include a date or a name. Spot samplers have been dated to the mid-1600s on the basis of a group of dated spot samplers that Carol Humphrey of the Fitzwilliam Museum brought to light. Spot samplers are relatively rare survivals compared to band samplers, probably due to their continuing usefulness as a pattern reference, which would have worn them out through much use. The fact that these are rarely dated or signed may indicate that some are the work of professional embroiderers or teachers who produced them so that they could be sold, in which case they would not have been treasured and saved by the descendants of the makers in the same way as schoolgirl needlework. The manner in which the maker of this sampler used materials and the fact that several individual motifs in this piece were left half finished suggests that this is the first draft of a final work. Once the maker had mastered the technique and produced enough of the design to judge the final effect, there was no need to waste time and precious materials, particularly metal threads, in completing the motif. 10-stitch motifs or slips on spot samplers were intended to be cut out and applied to another ground fabric for the production of valances, bed hangings or cushion covers. I am very fortunate to have many beautiful band samplers in my private collection. The sampler on the screen is Bethia. She takes pride of place in my collection. The photograph on the left is the antique sampler and the photograph on the right is my reproduction. Bethia has a remarkable history. In the first part of the 20th century, the sampler was in the collection of Emma Henriette Schiff von Severo. Emma belonged to an important and influential Jewish family who owned and lived in the Grand Palais Reitzes in Vienna. Emma's father had founded one of the largest and most successful banks in Austria. Emma married the fabulously wealthy banker and Romanian consul general Paul Schiff von Severo. He built her the beautiful Villa Emma, and no expense was spared in its construction and furnishing. Great wealth did not guarantee Emma happiness. Her husband died in 1924, and her only child, a son, committed suicide 4 years later, aged just 25. On March the 12th, 1938, a campaign of terror, systematic intimidation and persecution started against Austria's Jewish population. Deportation to concentration and labour camps quickly followed. Emma was not immediately deported, but was relocated from her grand home. Her collections of textiles, paintings, furniture and porcelain were held at the St. Lucas Gallery in Vienna, officially to be inventoried and valued. Emma died in January 1939. Her nephew and heir, who had been arrested by the Nazis and later released, had fled the country and was living in the United States. He was denied an export licence for his aunt's collections. On March 1st, 1939, the Austrian Museum of Applied Arts requested the seizure of the Schiff von Severo collection. Emma's nephew was forced to negotiate the sale of his aunt's valuable collections for a pittance. Over 140 examples of textile art alone entered the museum. None of the pieces seem to have been displayed, and the museum's superb storage conditions kept the Schiff von Severo collection in an excellent state of conservation. Bethia's sampler did not see daylight for 7 decades. When the Austrian government passed new restitution laws, Emma's textile collection was returned to her relatives. The collection was quickly put up for auction through Christie's, and 2 separate sales were held in 2003. Many of the items were acquired by museums throughout the world. I first saw this stunning band sampler in 2015, and I immediately knew that I had to have her. When Bethia arrived, I spent many hours studying her. I realised that she had to have been reversibly stitched. The only way to confirm this was to take her out of the frame to expose the back. Unless you study the back of a band sampler, you cannot reproduce it authentically. The back reveals the stitch path and accurately identifies the stitch used. Bethia stitched her sampler with polychrome silks, ingeniously devising stitch patterns and motifs. There is so much to delight in her sampler. She used a wide repertoire of stitches of varying intricacy. The stitches include 2 different versions of reversible cross stitch. One forms a cross on the reverse with a vertical stitch on the left, and the other a 4-sided stitch on the reverse. She also used double backstitch and diagonal double backstitch. These stitches appeared plaited from the front and 2 parallel rows of backstitch on the reverse. You might know them as closed herringbone. Other stitches used were double-sided Italian stitch, alternating double backstitch in groups of 3, which represents the Trinity, detached buttonhole, French knots, and satin stitch. Betthia's whitework bands are particularly elegant. Narrow whitework bands were an important part of the stitcher's repertoire. They were used on collar bands, both as an adornment and as stiffening, so that the collars would stand proud. On some samplers, whitework bands were stitched with linen thread that had been withdrawn from the actual ground fabric. Betthia's sampler was stitched in Norfolk, England. We believe that she came from a family that supported the crown. Why do we think this? It is because of the motifs that Bethia stitched in her sampler. There are numerous acorns. The acorn had a symbolic association with the royalist cause in the 17th century. Charles II hid in an oak tree when fleeing the Roundheads in 1651 after the Battle of Worcester. The sampler features 2 sunflowers. Charles I was known as the Sun King before Louis XIV of France gained the title. The sunflower follows the sun, and it came to signify the Stuart monarchy by royalist supporters. Sunflowers symbolise adoration, loyalty and longevity. One of the sunflowers on the sampler has no seeds. After studying under high magnification every single stitch Bethia made, I do not believe that this was an oversight. Bethia was a meticulous needleworker. I believe that she deliberately left the centre of the one sunflower empty to represent Charles II's wife, Katharine of Braganza, who was barren. A pineapple is another motif associated with Charles II, after he was painted receiving what was thought to be the first pineapple grown in England. Today, the painting belongs to His Majesty the King and can be seen in the Royal Collection. We now know that it cannot have been the first pineapple grown, as tradition maintains, but the first ripened. Growing pineapples domestically had become a race between European kings, and each was desperate to outdo the other by being the first to boast of homegrown pineapples. The pineapple was known as the fruit of kings, and its leaves were compared to a crown, and its manner of propagating through heirs to the laws of kingly succession. Where leaves are seen projecting from either side of a fruit, the fruit is generally interpreted as being a pineapple. We learn so much through samplers. Towards the end of the 1600s, we see the start of a decline in the popularity of the traditional English band sampler and a change in the needlework being produced. What caused the change? The answer is probably as simple as the fact that people change. Time changes everything. History has shown us, and continues to show us, that all things change for a variety of reasons. Over time, the new replaces the old. People are influenced greatly by everything that happens around them. So what was happening in the 1600s? It was a fascinating period of English history. This turbulent age saw three major events that had a deep impact on England's political and social life. The English Civil War, the restoration of the Stuarts in 1660, and the Glorious Revolution in 1688. Amidst the turmoil of these events, people's everyday lives unfolded. The Civil War was bitterly fought between the Cavaliers and Roundheads and probably had the greatest impact on women's lives, and it was a time of great change for them. More than simply a war, it was a period of disruption, questioning, revolutionary ideas and actions shared across social divides. Both royalist and parliamentary women were involved in the realities of war. Women, no less than men, took sides in the conflict, championed causes and raged against enemies. Most of all, they carried on as best as they could in a world that was being turned upside down. They ran estates and businesses while their fathers, husbands and sons went to war, into exile or imprisonment, some even physically defending their homes. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 saw James II flee into France and his daughter Mary and her husband William of Orange taking his throne. Mary's acquired Dutch taste ushered in new styles influenced by Indian chintzes. At the end of the 1600s, the Western imagination became entranced by anything Oriental, and this style dramatically influenced the designs and techniques used on furniture, furnishings, textiles and costumes. Stumpwork, with its complex raised work and needle-lace techniques, which had been so fashionable during the reign of the Stuart dynasty, declined in popularity. A major factor behind the change was that as decorative woven and printed textiles became increasingly available, the need for embroidery as a means of enhancing plain textiles reduced accordingly. Living in the 21st century, fabric is ubiquitous and readily affordable. Most of us have no involvement in its production. We have not witnessed the laborious processes and multiple steps that go into even making the simplest of cloth. It is hard to imagine that they were once such valuable commodities that they affected world events. By the 1700s, Spitalfields in London had become a major centre for European silk weaving. Weavers there produced silks that were among the most expensive and fashionable dress fabrics of their time. The amazingly intricate fabrics they wove had elaborate floral and exotic patterns, sometimes with silver and gold gilt threads. Whilst the 1700s saw two abortive attempts by the Jacobites to restore the Catholic Stuart kings to the throne, the century was overall one of political calm in Britain. It was a period of peace and prosperity for the upper classes, a time of scientific discoveries and inventions. Crompton's spinning jenny and James Watt's discoveries leading to the steam engine and the Industrial Revolution. It was a period of exploration when distant countries were discovered and mapped. During all of this, almost imperceptibly, the education of girls became more widespread. More women could read and write, and girls were being sent to school. In 1725, Dr. Isaac Watts published the Treatise on the Education of Children. Watts recommended that both sexes should study mathematics, including algebra and geometry, geography and astronomy. Samplers started to be used as a tool to instruct young girls, not only in religion, morality and virtue, but academic subjects too. Cross-stitch became the mainstay of most needlewomen's repertoire and was the first and sometimes the only stitch worked on a little girl's sampler. Cross-stitch became known as sampler stitch. The sampler became shorter and gradually widened. The border began to appear first as an edging, then as a more definite border. The use of a border indicates that samplers were now being worked with the intention of being framed. Lettering ceased to be used primarily for marking. Following the publication of John Wesley's hymns in 1736 and the popularisation of Methodism, verses are found on many samplers. The name of the needleworker and the date she finished her sampler was usually included, and sometimes the name of her teacher and school appear too. By the beginning of the 1800s, the sampler became for the most part stereotyped, and a typical design would be a meandering flowered border containing a central house surrounded by fruit trees, pots of flowers, angels, birds, dogs and cats, and a verse. What have I taken from my research of needlework from the 16, 17 and 1800s? It is that crafts evolve from mankind's basic need, and the development of domestic embroidery has accompanied us through our pilgrimage of life. The history of needlework really does reflect the story of civilization. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and will join me for the next presentation from Mrs. Parkman's Academy of Needlework. Thank you.